Daniel Trent never considered himself a man prone to superstition. As a dermatologist, he was grounded in the precision of science, every diagnosis a puzzle to solve, every rash or lesion a case for logic and reason. His practice had earned him a reputation for clear-eyed pragmatism, a talent for separating fact from hysteria when patients arrived convinced their mole was cancerous or their wrinkles could be erased overnight. So when the man came to his office, skin peeling in grotesque wet sheets, Daniel had treated him like any other patient. "What do you think, doctor?" the man asked, his voice hoarse, eyes sunken into a face that looked more like melting wax than human flesh. His arms were bandaged, his chest crisscrossed with scars, old and fresh alike. Daniel didn't answer immediately. The case was beyond anything he had seen in textbooks or medical journals. Each layer of the man's skin seemed to slough off with startling ease, revealing underneath patches of fresh, strangely textured skin. Some parts were smooth, pale, almost translucent. Others were darker, rougher, scarred. Daniel peered closely at one particular patch, a faint birthmark on the man's forearm in the shape of an odd swirl. He could have sworn he'd seen it before, on another patient, but that was impossible. He dismissed the idea as nothing more than a coincidence. "We'll run some tests," Daniel finally said, though he had no idea what kind of tests could explain this. "We'll figure this out." The man looked at him with hollow eyes, his mouth curling into a grim, humorless smile. "I'm not sure there's anything left to figure out, Doc." Daniel prescribed creams, antibiotics, and a regimen of treatments designed to combat what he could only classify as some unknown autoimmune condition. He told himself this was just another puzzle, and he would find the solution. That's what he did. He fixed things. Skin was a surface, and all surfaces could be repaired. But 3 days later, the man was dead. It wasn't the death that disturbed Daniel. It was the condition in which the man was found. His body had shed completely, nothing left but sinew and bone, a husk of what had once been human, and beneath that final layer, patches of new skin. But that skin wasn't his own. It was alien, belonging to others. The man had left something behind in Daniel's office. Among the stacks of patient files and medical reports lay a small, worn, leather-bound book. Daniel hadn't noticed it at first. It seemed to blend into the chaos of his office, almost invisible. But the night of the man's death, it caught his eye. He flipped it open. The pages were old, yellowed with time, filled with drawings and notations that resembled ancient medical texts, diagrams of the human body, charts of skin patterns, annotations in a language Daniel couldn't recognize. But the more he examined it, the more it felt familiar. There was something in those diagrams, the lines of text, that seemed to call to him. One section in particular stood out: the eternal skin, a promise of renewal and rejuvenation. Daniel's heart raced as he read the passages. The text described techniques to regenerate skin, to reverse aging, to heal scars and wounds with an ancient ritual. It was impossible, fantastical. Yet the words held him captive. They promised miracles beyond science, and Daniel was desperate. The patient's death had rattled him, shaken the foundation of his understanding. The idea of something beyond his control, beyond science, gnawed at him. The book felt like an answer, a key to unlock the mysteries of the skin. After all, he had spent his entire career focused on repairing what was broken: acne, eczema, scar tissue, all the imperfections that masked a person's true self. But now, this book whispered of a way to not just treat skin, but to transform it entirely. At the end of the chapter on regeneration, written in bold, ominous letters, was a warning. Do not proceed beyond this point. There is no return. A shiver crawled up Daniel's spine as he read it. The rational part of his mind urged him to put the book down, to dismiss it as nothing more than an ancient relic, a collection of superstitions that had no place in modern medicine. But another part of him, a darker, more desperate part, was intrigued. What if it was real? What if it was the key to solving not just his patient's death, but something greater? The words of the man echoed in his mind. "There's nothing left to figure out, Doc." Daniel spent days researching the symbols and language in the book, growing more obsessed with every passing hour. Each page hinted at something ancient, forbidden. Yet there was a method to it, a ritual of sorts, involving herbs, blood, and specific incantations. His logical brain warred with his curiosity, but the temptation was too great. One night, after the clinic had closed and the streets outside his office were dark and quiet, Daniel made his decision. He locked the door, lit the candles as the book instructed, and gathered the materials. He wasn't a superstitious man. He didn't believe in curses, rituals, or ancient magic. But he believed in results. The ritual itself was simple. Too simple. A small cut on the fingertip to draw blood, mixed with crushed herbs that filled the air with an earthy, metallic scent. The incantations were whispered words from a language he didn't know, but they rolled off his tongue as though he had spoken them before. His hands moved through the motions almost automatically, his body acting on instinct rather than thought. As the ritual neared its end, a strange heat surged through his body, starting in his hands and spreading across his skin like wildfire. For a moment, Daniel felt an intense pressure beneath his flesh, as though his entire body were about to burst open. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white, trying to steady himself as nausea overtook him. And then it passed. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. He looked in the mirror, half expecting some drastic change, but there was nothing. His skin was the same. The ritual had failed. He felt foolish, embarrassed, but as he turned away from the mirror, he didn't notice the faint shimmer that had begun to spread across his skin, the first sign of something far more terrifying than he could ever have imagined. The curse had begun. Daniel woke up the next morning feeling a strange tightness across his skin, a sensation that wasn't painful but unusual. He blinked blearily at the sunlight streaming through the window and stretched, expecting the grogginess of another restless night. But as he moved, something felt different. He couldn't place it at first, just a vague awareness that his body wasn't behaving the way it normally did. Swinging his legs over the side of the bed, Daniel froze. His hands, once scarred by years of medical work, were smooth. He stared, blinking, half expecting the image to blur and correct itself, but it didn't. The faint burn scar on his right hand from an incident in medical school was gone. The small, jagged cut near his thumb where he'd slipped with a scalpel last week, gone. Every minor imperfection, every tiny wound from years of work had vanished. He rushed to the bathroom mirror, heart pounding in his chest. The face staring back at him was his own, but somehow different. His skin seemed tighter, brighter, and firmer. The fine lines that had begun to crease around his eyes were softened, almost erased. The dark circles that usually marked his exhaustion were nowhere to be seen. For the first time in years, Daniel felt young. It was miraculous. He touched his face, gingerly at first, then more urgently, as if trying to confirm that the skin was really his. He grinned, marveling at how smooth it felt. The ritual, it had worked. Despite his skepticism, the ancient techniques described in the book had delivered exactly what they promised. Renewal, healing, youth. The lingering doubt he had held about the strange ritual, about the warning scrawled at the end of the text, began to fade. For the next few days, Daniel couldn't stop looking at himself in the mirror. His skin was flawless, rejuvenated in a way that no modern science or cosmetic treatment could ever achieve. He felt invincible, confident. Every cut or scratch that appeared throughout the day healed overnight, sometimes within hours. But soon, the changes began to accelerate. What at first seemed like a miraculous blessing grew darker, more disturbing. It began with small patches of skin that peeled off easily, sloughing away like dead cells after a sunburn. The first time it happened, Daniel didn't think much of it. Skin sheds naturally, after all. He chalked it up to the accelerated regeneration, a side effect of the body's ability to heal itself so rapidly. But then it started happening more often. A patch of skin on his forearm flaked off one morning, leaving behind a fresh, raw layer that was smooth but wrong. The texture wasn't his. It felt too thick, too coarse. He rubbed his hand over the patch, frowning. The skin didn't belong to him. The sensation was faint, but there was something disturbingly alien about it. When he pressed his hand to it, he felt no connection to his own body. He tried to ignore it, but the shedding became more frequent. Patches of skin from his legs, his arms, even his face, peeled away like old wallpaper, revealing new, mismatched patches underneath. Some were lighter than his natural tone, others darker, with freckles and blemishes that didn't match his own. One day, after a shower, Daniel stared in horror at his leg. A patch of skin near his ankle had peeled off, exposing a section that was deeply tanned, with a faint birthmark shaped like a crescent moon. His breath caught in his throat. He recognized that mark. It was identical to a birthmark he had seen on a woman he treated 6 months ago. The woman had come in with a severe case of eczema, and he had spent weeks trying to heal her damaged skin. There was no doubt in his mind. This skin belonged to her. His mind raced. How could this be possible? He examined his leg, running his fingers over the patch. It didn't feel like his. The texture, the tone. It wasn't his skin. It was someone else's. Frantic, Daniel rushed back to the book. He flipped through the pages, searching for answers, for any explanation. The cryptic warnings at the end of the ritual text echoed in his mind, but they offered no comfort, no clarity. The book spoke only of rejuvenation, of regeneration, not of this mutation. His hands shook as he turned the final page, where the warning was scribbled in blood-red ink. Do not proceed. This is no gift. His mind reeled with panic. He tried to stay calm, to rationalize what was happening. But how could he? His body was transforming into something foreign, something wrong. The rapid regeneration had turned into something monstrous. The next morning, Daniel awoke to find more patches of skin shedding, faster now. Some parts of his body looked smooth and new, like his own skin had been replaced with a more youthful version. But other patches were different, darker, older, rougher. He traced a line down his chest where the skin was now a patchwork of tones, like a quilt of different people sewn together. A patch on his left arm caught his eye. It was olive-toned, with deep scars running diagonally across it. He had seen skin like this before, on an old man he had treated for skin cancer years ago. Daniel's heart raced. His body was becoming a collage of people he had once treated. The skin wasn't his. It belonged to them. His panic turned to dread. The skin that now covered his body wasn't just foreign, it was alive. At times, it moved on its own. He would feel an odd twitch under his skin, as if something was crawling beneath the surface. His muscles would spasm without warning, and when he looked down, he saw the skin shifting, as though it were trying to reshape itself. The skin wanted something. Days passed, and Daniel found himself haunted by flashes of memory that weren't his own. In his sleep, he dreamt of places he had never been, of moments he had never lived. He would wake up drenched in sweat, visions of lives he didn't recognize swirling in his mind. A mother's desperate cry for her child, an old man's painful final breath, a young woman's terror as she ran from something in the shadows. He realized with horror that these weren't just dreams, they were memories. The skin he now wore carried with it the consciousness of its previous owners. Their thoughts, their emotions, their pain, all fused into his body. Daniel tried to remove the foreign patches, but they regenerated almost instantly, stronger and more insistent. He even tried cutting away a particularly dark patch on his forearm, but the next morning it had regrown, even larger than before. Each new layer was more foreign, more detached from the body he had known his whole life. His skin was becoming a patchwork of lives, stitched together by a force he didn't understand. His own flesh was slipping away, replaced by the skin of strangers. And with each new layer, he felt less like himself. Daniel stared into the bathroom mirror one night, his reflection a grotesque collage of faces, tones, and textures. The skin under his eyes was pale and freckled, a patch of his cheek dark and wrinkled. His body no longer belonged to him. The skin wasn't just changing, it was consuming him. The warning in the book had been right. This was no gift, it was a curse. Daniel's reflection in the mirror no longer belonged to him. He could barely recognize the person. No, the creature that stared back. His once familiar features had been replaced by a patchwork of skin, each piece foreign and alive, as if crawling with the memories and emotions of their former owners. The skin wasn't just on him, it was in him. It was controlling him. He leaned closer to the mirror, his fingers trembling as he traced the jagged lines where one patch of skin met another. His left cheek was now dark and wrinkled, the skin of an old man he had once treated for a melanoma removal. His jawline was dotted with freckles that weren't his, the skin soft and supple like that of a young woman he vaguely recalled seeing in his clinic months ago. His own skin was disappearing, overtaken by the lives of others. And with it, his sense of self was fading. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, the strange, creeping sensations, the odd moments when his hands moved without his permission, or his body twitched involuntarily. He would find himself standing in the middle of a room, confused about how he got there, as if he had blacked out for a moment. But the episodes became more frequent, more violent. It started with the hands. His hands, once his greatest tools as a surgeon, steady and precise, began to shake uncontrollably. They twitched, clenched into fists without warning, and sometimes moved on their own, reaching for things he had no intention of touching. One night, while sitting in his study, he found himself gripping the edge of his desk, his knuckles white and his nails digging into the wood. He stared at his hands in horror as they squeezed tighter, harder, as if driven by an unseen force. Then the memories began to surface. They weren't his. In flashes, Daniel saw things, moments, fragments of lives that didn't belong to him. A child crying for its mother in a smoky room. An old man sitting on a porch, staring into the endless night, a deep sadness pulling at his heart. A woman running, her feet pounding against cold pavement, terror driving her forward from something unseen but ever present. These memories would come suddenly, overwhelming him. He would be in the middle of eating dinner or brushing his teeth, and then he was someone else, living in a different moment. The thoughts, the emotions, they were real, visceral. He could feel their pain, their fear, their joy, and it was growing stronger. Each new piece of skin seemed to carry with it not just physical characteristics, but the essence of the person it had belonged to. The lives of these strangers were bleeding into his own, each one demanding attention, overwhelming his mind. At first, he tried to ignore it. He convinced himself that it was stress, a side effect of the accelerated regeneration process. But soon, Daniel couldn't deny what was happening. The skin wasn't just on him, it was becoming him. One night he woke in a cold sweat, the sheets tangled around his legs. His heart was pounding, his chest tight. He had been dreaming. No, reliving someone else's nightmare. He had seen himself through the eyes of a woman running down a dark alley, her breath ragged, her heart racing in her chest. She had been terrified. and Daniel had felt every ounce of that fear as if it were his own. But it didn't stop when he woke up. Even in the waking world, Daniel felt her terror gripping him, suffocating him. His body acted on its own, thrashing in the bed, as if still trying to escape whatever had been chasing her. His muscles spasmed, his skin prickling with the memory of her fear. He couldn't breathe. His hands reached for his throat, clawing at the skin there, but it wasn't his hands. It was hers. In that moment, Daniel wasn't himself. He was her. When the episode finally passed, Daniel lay in bed, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. The room was dark and quiet, but inside him there was a storm. He felt their emotions, all of them. Rage, sorrow, grief, despair. They churned within him, fighting for control, each one louder and more insistent than the last. He wasn't just Daniel anymore. He was a vessel for these lives, for these memories. And he was losing control. The next day, Daniel stood in his bathroom, staring into the mirror, hoping to find some shred of himself left. His skin was a tapestry of others now, each patch moving subtly, almost imperceptibly. It was as though the skin was alive, each section pulsing with the memories of its original owner. His reflection flickered in and out of focus, his face shifting, warping as if different parts of him were vying for dominance. He reached up to touch his face, but his hand didn't move. His body was no longer his to command. His limbs felt heavy, sluggish, as if weighed down by invisible chains. He could feel the presence of others inside him, hundreds of them, pulling him in different directions, each one wanting control, each one desperate to be heard. Suddenly, his arm jerked forward, smashing into the mirror. The glass shattered, shards raining down onto the sink. Blood pooled from his knuckles, but even as it flowed, the skin began to regenerate, closing the wound almost instantly. But it wasn't his hand that had acted. It wasn't his rage that had shattered the glass. It was theirs. He could feel it now, a dark, seething anger bubbling up from deep within. The man whose skin now covered his hand, he had died angry, violent. His rage had seeped into Daniel's very bones, twisting his thoughts, fueling his violent outburst. Daniel tried to push the emotion down, to wrest back control of his own mind, but it was no use. The harder he fought, the stronger their influence grew. He staggered backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His own thoughts were a distant echo, drowned out by the chorus of voices that now filled his mind. They whispered to him, screamed at him, wept through him. He could feel their pain, their sorrow, their anger, their deaths. Somehow their deaths had become a part of him, stitched into his very flesh. Each piece of skin carried with it not just a memory, but a soul. And those souls were angry. They had unfinished business, unresolved pain, and they were using him as a vessel to exact their revenge. Daniel found himself standing over his desk, hands trembling as he fumbled with the book. He had to find a way to stop this. He flipped through the pages, eyes scanning the faded text for answers, but there was nothing. No mention of how to reverse the ritual, no way to remove the cursed skin. The warning, hastily scrawled at the bottom of the final page, taunted him. "Do not proceed. This is no gift." Desperation clawed at him as he slammed the book shut. He paced the room, trying to clear his mind, but the voices were too loud, too overwhelming. His body moved without his permission, hands reaching for objects, fingers curling into fists. He could feel them, hundreds of lives, all pulling him apart, piece by piece. Daniel had thought the curse was physical. He had believed it was just his skin being replaced, that he could somehow fix it, contain it. But now he understood the horrible truth. The skin carried more than just memories. It carried them, their souls, their rage, their grief, and they were devouring him, erasing his very essence piece by piece. Each day, his own thoughts grew quieter, his will weaker. The skin was no longer content to simply replace him. It wanted to possess him, to become him. And soon, Daniel realized, there would be nothing left of him to fight. Daniel stood before the mirror, barely recognizing the person reflected back at him. His skin, if you could still call it that, was a nightmare of shifting textures and tones, a grotesque patchwork stitched together by forces far beyond his understanding. His once smooth, familiar face was gone, consumed by the living quilt of flesh that now moved and twitched with a life of its own. Each patch told a story, each piece alive with the memories and emotions of the people it had belonged to. They had all become part of him. He stared at the thing in the mirror, trying to find any trace of the man he once was. His eyes, bloodshot, sunken, and wild, were the only remnant of Daniel Trent, the dermatologist who had once been so proud of his rationality, of his science. Everything else had been taken from him, consumed by the curse that now wore him like a second skin. He reached up with trembling hands to touch his face, but even that simple act felt foreign. His fingers no longer responded the way they used to. They twitched and curled without his permission, driven by the violent memories imprinted on the flesh they bore. He could feel the others inside him, writhing beneath the surface. They weren't just memories anymore. They were alive, each one fighting for control, each one desperate to be heard. His hands closed into fists, the rough, calloused skin of a man he'd never met, clenching tight against his will. His body moved without him, jerking and spasming, as if a dozen invisible strings were pulling him in different directions. He could hear their voices now, not as whispers, but as screams. They filled his mind, a cacophony of rage, fear, and sorrow. "You did this to us," a voice shrieked from deep within, a voice that wasn't his own. "You took us." Daniel's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. He stumbled back from the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he felt like he was losing his grip on reality, as though the boundaries between himself and the others were dissolving completely. "Please, stop," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "I didn't mean to," but there was no stopping it. There was no undoing what he had done. The ritual, the curse, it had taken him too far. His skin was no longer his own, and neither was his mind. He could feel them inside him now more clearly than ever before, the hundreds of souls whose flesh had become part of his body. Each one brought with it its own pain, its own rage, its own unresolved trauma. The memories, the emotions, they were overwhelming, crushing him under their weight. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head in his hands, trying to block out the voices, the memories, the visions. But it was useless. His body jerked and convulsed, muscles twitching as if controlled by a puppet master pulling invisible strings. In his mind's eye, Daniel saw them, the people whose lives he had stolen, whose bodies now coated his own. A young woman with dark, frightened eyes, an old man, bitter and broken by years of pain, a mother screaming for a child she would never see again. They all came to him, their faces twisted in anger and sorrow, their hands reaching for him, accusing him. And then, in the final horrific moment of clarity, Daniel realized the truth. The curse had never been about eternal youth or beauty. It had never been about rejuvenation. It had been about possession. The skin wasn't just a physical transformation, it was a prison. A prison for all the souls that had been claimed by the ritual, their lives now trapped within the flesh that coated his body. And now Daniel was their vessel, their puppet, their host. He was no longer Daniel Trent. He was them. As the realization sank in, Daniel felt his consciousness flicker, like a dying light bulb struggling to stay on. He was losing himself. His thoughts, his memories, his very identity were being swallowed whole by the others. Piece by piece, they were erasing him, consuming him until nothing of him remained. He looked up at the mirror one last time. The face staring back at him was no longer his own. It was a grotesque patchwork of different skins, each one moving subtly, as if the faces beneath were shifting, fighting for dominance. His mouth opened, but the voice that came out wasn't his. "We are one," the voices whispered, a chorus of pain and anger. "We are all." Daniel's scream died in his throat. He could no longer tell if it was his voice or theirs. His hands moved without his control, slowly reaching up to his face. His fingers curled into claws, nails digging into the soft flesh of his cheeks. He tried to stop them, tried to regain control, but it was too late. The skin beneath his nails tore, and with it came a flood of memories. Hundreds of lives flashing before his eyes, each one more vivid than the last. He could see their deaths, feel their pain, their fear. It overwhelmed him, drowning him in a sea of emotions that weren't his own. His hands continued to claw at his face, ripping away the patches of skin, but every piece he tore off revealed another and another, each one more foreign, more alien. There was no end to it. He could tear forever and never find himself again. Daniel's vision blurred, the world around him spinning out of control. His mind fragmented, splintering under the weight of the lives inside him. He could feel his own consciousness fading, slipping away like sand through his fingers. He was being erased piece by piece, consumed by the souls that now lived within him. In the final moment before darkness consumed him, Daniel looked into the mirror and saw what he had become. His face, a grotesque mosaic of stolen flesh, twisted and shifted, each piece moving as if controlled by a different person. A chorus of voices rose from deep within him, each one speaking in a different tone, a different language. And then, all at once, they spoke together. "We are not yours. You are ours." Daniel's scream tore through the air, but it was swallowed by the chorus of voices, drowned out by the cacophony of souls that had taken him. His reflection in the mirror, now a patchwork of 100 different lives, stared back at him, its eyes wide with terror, its mouth open in a silent scream. And then, with one final shuddering breath, Daniel was gone. What remained was no longer him. It was them. The mirror cracked, splintering as if it could no longer hold the weight of what stood before it. And in the shattered glass, the faces of the dead, angry, grieving, vengeful, stared back. They had won.